This tutorial series has been sponsored by Vox Link, a new social media app where you can find like-minded players in your area. Whether you're a new or returning player, Vox Link has the community for you. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is the third and final installment on my How to Play Warhammer 40k 10th Edition series. While my other two videos on core and advanced rules have asked how you play a game of 40k, this video will answer the why you play. Missions and objectives have been a core part of the game since its inception, and the mission structure in 10th edition is a wide departure from missions in previous editions. However, it is one of the most interesting and dynamic systems that we've ever seen in the game. So today I'm going to talk to you about how to set up a mission, use the Leviathan mission deck, choose secondaries, score out the mission, and finally win the game. Games in Warhammer 40k are won and lost based on your victory point score. The game will progress over 5 rounds, and players will score up to 100 points. 50 points from a primary objective, 40 points from a player-selected secondary objective, and 10 points if their army's painted. At the end of that 5th battle round, if a player has more points than their opponent, they are the victor. All of the rules for playing missions in Warhammer 40k come in this set. The Leviathan mission deck. It's available from Games Workshop as a deck. You can buy the whole set of cards and all of the additional accessories included. Can find printable versions online. There are some free apps as well that have the same functionality as the deck without having to use the actual physical cards. Now, this set includes all of the mission rules for playing games in Warhammer 40k. Those are on these card decks over here. This includes your deployment, mission special rules, as well as primary mission, which determines how you score. When you go to set up a game of Warhammer 40,000, what you can do is draw cards from this deck, or if you agree with your opponent, you can choose the cards that you want to play with. There are also in the what's called the Leviathan Companion, which is Games Workshop's recommended competitive play format. There are presets, predetermined combinations. If you don't want to draw them yourself, that's available over on Warhammer Community in the download section. So when you get to a table with your opponent, after you've constructed your armies, you'll take each of these card piles individually, deployment, mission rule, and primary mission. You'll shuffle them up and you'll draw one of each. So in this case, assuming that we drew whatever's on the top here, obviously you would flip them over to draw them. That's how cards work generally. We would be playing Hammer and Anvil today. Now all of the cards are illustrated, assuming that you're playing on a 44-inch by 60-inch play area. That's the recommended game size for a game of 40k at about 1,000 to 2,000 points. However, you can play on different game sizes. For that reason, all of the measurements for the objective markers are measured to the center of the table, not the board edges. So this will describe where you place 5 objectives, and it will describe where the attacker and defender deployment zones are. You'll find that every mission has 1 objective in each player's deployment zone and 1 objective in the center. And there are some special rules that can muck with those, but those are important for some secondary objectives that we'll discuss later. So this is your mission setup. You would then go and draw a card from the mission special rule. The most common one is Chilling Rain. That just means that there is no special rule for that mission, but we also have things like Hidden Supplies, which creates additional objective markers, Minefields, which can deal mortal wounds to your units when they advance too far. A lot of interesting and there's kind of narrative inclusions in this deck to spice up the mission just a little bit. And then last and certainly not least is the primary mission. This will determine how you actually score primary objective points. Each game in Leviathan 40k is divided into 3 methods of scoring: primary objectives, secondary objectives, and battle ready points. The battle ready points, you just get 10 points for painting your army. There's a lot of events, especially smaller events, that will just add this to your score automatically, so painting's not required. But if you're playing with your friends, you can discuss with them whether to use that role. It's kind of a controversial one. Primary objectives are what are scored by these primary missions, and it will describe to you exactly how they're scored. Usually, this is by controlling objectives at the end of your command phase. In this example, Take and Hold scores you 5 victory points for each objective marker out of the 5 that we determined in the mission deployment that you control at the end of your command phase. Now, generally speaking, the primary objectives will not score on the first battle round, so you'll have battle rounds 2 through 5 in order to complete them. However, if you're the player going second, so your opponent got to act first in the first battle round, then you oftentimes will get a little bit of a bonus at the end, either scoring these points at the end of your turn, meaning you can take new objectives to score them, or otherwise getting some sort of benefit at the end of the game in order to make up for the advantage that the first player has being able to move and attack first. This video has been sponsored by Vox Link, a new social media app designed by gamers for gamers. Whether or not you're brand new to Warhammer 40,000, getting back into the game, or just moving to a new location, finding a community that meshes with your playstyle, plays the type of games that you want, and values the same things on the tabletop that you do is of paramount importance for everyone to enjoy the game. It offers a place to find and meet new members of the community and find players and events in your local area to meet up for games. Vox Link is available totally free for users on Android and iOS, and you can find links to download it in the video description and the card on the screen right now. Currently, it offers a live feed and social media features so you can post about your games, upcoming events, or even just models that you've painted. It also showcases content from a variety of different content creators in the tabletop gaming sphere, including yours truly. We embarked on a quest to become the #1 liked channel on Vox Link, and I'm happy to say that we succeeded. So big thanks to everybody who joined the app and hit that heart button next to Tactical Tortoise. If you haven't done that yet, please go do so, and just check out Vox Link for all the cool features that it has. So I'll see you there.
Previously on Family Guy.
Is Inky about to attack me? Yeah. What's up? Okay. No, don't stand in front of the cameras.
And now, the conclusion.
Now, the Leviathan deck also includes two objective sets. There's a green one for Defender and a red one for Attacker. Although a common misconception here is that you are required to use these individual decks if you're playing in that seat. You, in fact, don't. The decks are identical. There are just two decks so that you can play a full game of 40k with only this deck. You don't need a second deck. The decks include a set of Gambits as well as a set of secondary missions. After you've set up the battlefield, determined your terrain layout, and determined attacker and defender, so rolled off to see who's going to deploy the first unit, you will then choose your objective type. There are two forms of objective inside the deck. There are fixed objectives and tactical objectives. Fixed objectives are cards that have this little, I guess it's like a file thing on it. I don't know. This means that you can choose two of these objectives with this symbol at the beginning of the game. If you do so, you don't use the tactical objective system that we'll be discussing momentarily. Instead, you'll simply use those two objectives that you selected. If you elect not to do that, you use what is called tactical objectives. These are objectives that can change every turn of the game. So you'll take all of these cards, that even the ones that have this little symbol on them, and you'll shuffle them together into a secondary objective deck. Then, at the start of each of your turns, you are going to be drawing two of these cards, or at least up to two. You'll have a hand of two cards, and if you retain cards from turn to turn, you'll just draw up to having two active at any one time. Each of these objective cards describe a criteria at which they are fulfilled. Once the objective is completed, they are discarded and put into a separate pile, and you'll, in the start of your next command phase, redraw a new one. The benefit of taking tactical objectives is that they oftentimes score more quickly than fixed objectives, but obviously you could be asked by the deck to complete objectives that are very difficult or even impossible for you to do. That said, there are some mechanics with your tactical objectives that allow you to control your hand and control your deck a little bit. The first one is that at the end of your turn, you can discard any cards in your hand that you want to. If you drew two cards that are bad, you could discard both of them, wait a turn, or wait a round, and then at the beginning of your next turn, draw two new cards. The other one is that selecting to take tactical objectives at the start of the game will give you access to a new stratagem called New Orders. It's a one-use stratagem. You can only do it once per game, but it allows you at the end of your command phase to take one of your secondary objective cards, discard it, and immediately draw a new one. The benefit of this is that you get the opportunity to score it that round, whereas discarding it at the end of your turn obviously would leave you without an objective for that turn and potentially your opponent's turn. If you choose to discard a secondary objective card at the end of your turn, rather than using New Orders for it, you actually gain a command point. Now, this is not cumulative with other command point gaining effects, so just like we talked about in the previous video in the series, you can only generate one additional command point over the normally generated command points by the core rules, one per battle round. So if you've already gained a command point from an ability or another special rule that you have, you cannot then discard a card to gain a command point. You can discard them, you just won't get the CP for it. But if you haven't gained any additional CP, you get a free one, which is kind of nice. Smooths over your tactical objectives a little bit. Over the course of scoring in a game of Warhammer, you can score up to 40 points on your secondary objectives, whether they are tactical or fixed. Each tactical objective will tell you how much you can score on that card specifically, but you're otherwise unrestrained until you hit your 40-point secondary objective cap. If you take fixed objectives, however, each of those objective cards can only score 20 points, so you would have to complete both of them to the max in order to actually score your maximum secondary objectives. These tokens right here are the objective markers. If we pop them out of the cards board, you can see that they're a 40mm round token. This is the actual objective marker that 40k uses. However, objective markers have a zone of influence that is 3 inches from the edge of this token. So what you'll oftentimes see is players have a large, usually like a neoprene mat that's 7.5 inches just about, which represents the central token plus the 3-inch control area. And that leads me into talking about how objective control is calculated and how objectives are actually taken. Now, an objective marker in 40k is a 40mm token like the ones that I showed during the tabletop demonstration. In order to control an objective, models must be within 3 inches of that marker. According to the core rules, this objective marker is impassable. You're able to walk over it but not stand on top of it. However, there was an update to that in the Leviathan Companion, which allows you to stand on top of this to make the game less complicated. So most players will be playing it that way, and that's how I'm going to be presenting it for the remainder of this video. Now, the 40mm token itself is just the center of a large aura that actually constitutes its objective control. Models within 3 inches of that objective marker can try to take the objective marker from their opponent. That is why oftentimes you'll see this large mat being used by players rather than the little puck. The mat is simply the 40mm marker in the center and 3 inches around that from any point. It's important to note, however, that only this small circle in the middle is the actual objective marker. The rest of it is just its zone of influence, essentially, and doesn't actually constitute the marker. So if you have a rule that measures to an objective marker, or your models are meant to move towards an objective marker, like during combat moves, as we talked about before, you will measure to the 40mm marker itself, not the zone around it. This is just for ease of measurement. It should be noted that this entire distance is also measured vertically, 5 inches, so it's not just a disc, it's essentially a big cylinder. This is so that models on higher level terrain or that are up above the table are able to contribute their control of objectives or attempt to take objectives even though they're on the ground floor and not physically within 3 inches of the token itself. Now, at the end of each phase, objective control is checked. Now, objective control is actually a stat on each model's datasheet. We've talked about basically every statistic on the datasheet throughout this course of the series, but OC is the one that we haven't touched on yet. OC obviously stands for objective control, and it is the weight that a model has in that unit when controlling an objective. For example, these Space Marine Scouts here are OC1, however, these Termagants are OC2. Each model that is within range of an objective marker, that is to say within 3 inches of that objective marker, adds its OC value to the marker. This is by model, not by unit. So even though all of the Termagants in this unit are with OC2 each would be a total of 20, only 2 of them are on the objective, so those 2 are the only ones adding their objective control. In this case, because we have 5 OC1 Scouts and 2 OC2 Termagants, the Termagants currently have an objective control score of 4 on this objective. The Scouts have an objective control score of 5, so the Space Marine player would have control of that objective. If the Tyranid player wanted to take that objective, they could place 1 additional Termagant there, and they would have 6 OC, which would beat the Scouts OC. This checks at the end of each phase, so objective dark markers don't flip control in the middle of a phase. There are some models or abilities that care about whether they're on an objective marker they control, or they're attacking someone on an objective marker they control. The control of the objective marker is locked in for that phase. So for example, if you move onto an objective marker to take it in your movement phase, it's not actually yours until the end of the movement phase, start of the shooting phase. If neither player has any models on the objective, obviously their total of objective control would then be 0, which means that no models have the objective. Now, an effect of battle shock that we've discussed earlier is that the objective control characteristic of models in that unit becomes 0. This means they are not considered for control of an objective until the battle shock effect wears off. So let's say, for example, we have a bunch of these termagants standing on an objective, but they are battle shocked. Because each of these termagant models is OC 0, only a single scout is required for you to take the objective. If there were no Space Marine models here, and these termagants were battle shocked, they would be contributing 0 OC to the objective, the same as their opponent, which means neither player would control the objective. Primary objectives from the Leviathan mission deck are typically scored at the end of your command phase, which is after the battle shock step has concluded. So one thing to think about is if you have a unit that must take battle shock at that time, you could lose control of your objectives before you score them. And battle shock can also affect some other mechanics in the scoring system, such as secondary objectives or actions. Now, many secondary objectives require that you perform actions. Action is not an actual game term. It's just a colloquialism by the community because it used to be the game term in 9th edition, and they basically just transposed the mechanic. These style of effects have some requirements, specifically about the eligibility to shoot, and I'll break them down on TTS right now. So you'll find that many effects, such as secondary objectives like cleanse, deploy teleport homers, investigate signals, or primary objectives like the ritual, have essentially the same mechanic on them. This is a mechanic that during your shooting phase requires one of your units to forego its ability to shoot or charge in order to complete that objective. The requirement for this is the eligibility to shoot, and that creates some weird idiosyncrasies that I'll talk about here. Now, when a unit wants to perform an action, they just must declare so before they shoot in your shooting phase if they are eligible to do so. And once they've declared that, they cannot shoot or charge for the remainder of the turn. They aren't allowed to automatically fail the action in order to try to shoot or charge. They simply are unable to do it. So you are incentivized to declare your actions towards the end of your shooting phase, because then you get to see what all your other units do, and you can decide then if you need those guys to shoot or charge later on in that turn. If you don't, you can then say, I'll perform the action and end your shooting phase. A unit is eligible to shoot if it has not yet shot already, is not in melee, has not advanced or fallen back. However, there are some things that can override that. For example, being a monster or vehicle gives you big guns never tire, which we talked about in the previous video. This means that monsters or vehicles that are engaged in melee are still eligible to shoot. They just have some restrictions and penalties on what they can attack. Obviously, if they are performing actions, they aren't then allowed to attack anyway, so you're not really that worried about it. All you care is that big guns never tire allows you to shoot in melee, meaning that these Hive Tyrant and this Land Raider, if called upon to perform an action, are eligible to do so even though they're in melee. They won't be able to charge, but interestingly, units that are currently performing actions will still fight in the fight phase. So they'll be able to make their attacks, pile in, consolidate, and stuff like that, but they just can't declare any charges. Over here, we have a little bit of a different conundrum. Neither of these units are monsters or vehicles. The Zoanthropes here and the Tactical Marines are all infantry, meaning that while in engaging range of enemies, they are not eligible to shoot. However, the Tactical Marines are equipped with pistols. They have some bolt pistols on their profile, which means that they are eligible to shoot while in melee, meaning that they're also eligible to perform actions. Last but certainly not least, units that advanced are also not eligible to shoot unless they have assault weapons. These termagants here are equipped with flesh borers, which are assault weapons, meaning that they are still eligible to shoot after advancing, which also means that they can advance and perform actions. You'll oftentimes find players that are overvaluing things like pistols or assault weapons, specifically for this reason. It gives them much more flexibility when performing actions. Actions also typically require the unit to not be battle shocked, so it adds a little bit of an additional downside to having your units be battle shocked if you have secondary objectives that require you to complete actions. Once the action is declared in the shooting phase, they will generally be completed at the end of your turn, so you will forego that unit's remaining activity for the rest of the turn, only fighting if it gets charged or engaged. And then the action will be completed, usually as long as the unit hasn't moved from its original location. You'll also find that there are some stratagems and special abilities that allow units to fall back and shoot or advance and shoot. Those also allow these units to fall back or advance and perform actions. Now, the last way that players can score beyond their primary objective, secondary objective, is Gambits. That's why each player has a Gambit deck. Now, these are generally speaking not very powerful and very difficult to achieve. So in, I would say, 99% of your games of 40k, you will not be using them, but they are part of the mission structure, so we'll talk about them now. At the end of the third battle round, so after both players have taken their third turns, players can choose if they decide to use a Gambit. There is a Proceed as Planned card within the Gambit deck. If you don't want to use a Gambit, you will simply put that one face down, and then your opponent will either do so as well or choose a Gambit themselves to use. To choose a Gambit, you take the remaining 3 cards in the Gambit deck, shuffle them together, and discard one of them. From the remaining 2, you get to choose one to use. So if I were to discard one, I would be able to choose between these ones, and I would choose whichever one's better for me. These restrict you from scoring the primary objective at all. You'll still be able to get secondary objectives, but you can no longer score from the mission objectives on the table. Instead, you will get a new criteria to complete. These are usually very difficult things like engaging enemies in melee, or getting to the corners of the battlefield, or clustering in the center. Usually it's about positioning. Then at the end of your 5th turn, so your turn in the 5th battle round, you will resolve the effect of the Gambit. Usually this requires a dice roll, depending on the number of units that you have in the area of the table that the Gambit requires. If you successfully complete its requirements, it will score you a bunch of primary objective points. So it is a way to, instead of scoring the primary objective, if your opponent has been good enough to dominate you on that, you can, for battle rounds 4 and 5, trade that away in order to get one of these cards instead. That's available to both players. There's no criteria to unlock it. You just have to decide at the end of the 3rd battle round, and then they resolve at the end of the game. So your opponent does have a little bit of knowledge on rounds 4 and 5, what you're going to be trying to accomplish. Games of Warhammer 40,000 last 5 battle rounds. At the end of the 5th battle round, you will tally up all of the primary objective points that you scored over the course of that game up to 50 points, and all of the secondary objectives that you scored over the game up to 40 points, or 20 points for each fixed secondary objective if you selected to take fixed secondaries. If your army is painted, you'll get an additional 10 points for a grand total of a maximum of 100. Whichever player has more victory points at the end of the game wins. And that's it. That's how you win 40k. If you have the same score as your opponent at the end of the game, you tied. That's very rare in Warhammer 40,000, but it does happen sometimes, and when you do, the game is a draw. Congratulations, that just means it was a sweet game. And with that, that concludes this tutorial series. Big thanks to Vox Link for sponsoring this video series. It was a lot of work putting all of these videos together, and it wouldn't be possible without their help. Also, big shout out to all the folks who support the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, my folks over on Twitch, the Purple channel. You can join over at twitch.tv/TacticalTortoiseTV, as well as YouTube channel members. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.